How does somebody become brave, do you think? What gives us courage? At least in my own life, in the moments that I rise slightly above my usual level of chicken-heartedness, what I find helps me to be more courageous, to do the thing that takes me out of my comfort zones, to say the thing I was afraid to say, to have the conversation I was a little bit nervous about having, or take the stand that I feel like I have to take. Often what helps me is when somebody else is there with me. When somebody else is brave, it can become contagious. And we find we get courage by other people's willingness to be courageous around us. We're going to see that on display in the story we're looking at this week in our session in our ongoing fall series, Faithful Rebels, as we take a look at these three young men in the fire and who might just be the fourth face with them. Throughout this fall, we've been taking a look at stories we're calling devout defiance stories, people who are being faithful to God and therefore are led to refuse to do what the powers of the day tell them to do, to stand up, to go against the flow. We've seen a bunch of different kinds of stories and throughout different moments in ancient Israel's history, from the pre-Exodus time of enslavement for the Hebrews to the prophet Elijah rebelling against his own king, to more recently, stories from the Babylonian exile time. Last week, we took a look at the story of Daniel and got introduced to three of his friends. They're people who had been sort of the elite, the best of the best in ancient Judah's society, and they're carried away into exile, and they were sort of made into be like celebrity mascots that the empire could put on display and say, look, these guys are on our side, these guys are going along with us, so you should too, to all those people who had been taken into captivity with the Babylonian exile as well. Daniel, and he has three friends. In their Hebrew names, they're remembered as Azariah, Hananiah, and Mishael, but the way empires often do. They want to erase any sense of the old identity, their old gods, their old culture, and so they give them new names, Babylonian names. You might be more familiar with their three names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We talked last week how part of what the empire was doing was trying to erase the old identity and give them new names that had to do with Babylonian deities and Babylonian gods, right? Your God doesn't mean anything. Our gods are the ones that matter. And we saw last week how Daniel and his friends refused to eat the king's food. They weren't going to not only take the risk of eating something that would violate the food laws of their Jewish faith, but also they didn't want to be turned into like celebrity poster boys for the Babylonian Empire, right? They didn't want to be carrying water for the Babylonians, right? They instead wanted to say, no, we're going to depend on God to take care of us. We're not going to accept the good things the Babylonians want to feed us because we don't want to just slide into accepting their culture or their power or their empire. We also saw last week how Daniel was willing to keep praying to God rather than to the pagan king Nebuchadnezzar, even when the penalty was being thrown into a den of lions, and how in that story, God saves Daniel from the lion's den, and even though he waits through the whole night with those lions there, the angel closes the mouths of the lions, and Daniel is kept safe. It seems like at the end of those stories, so the Babylonians are finally learning their lesson. Don't harass the people of God. And what do you know? This week, we're going to hear another story from the book of Daniel about these three guys who are Daniel's friends. Like I say, we were introduced to them last week by both their Hebrew names, Azariah, Hananiah, and Mishael, and how they're also given Babylonian names. And there's another law and another idolatrous command of the Babylonian king. In the third chapter of Daniel, the king Nebuchadnezzar makes a giant gold statue of himself and tells everybody you have to bow down and worship the statue. This story is not terribly subtle, right? So everybody in the Babylonian culture has no problem bowing down, right? Sure, their king is like a god. Sure, they're willing to do that, right? The king orders you to, and if the punishment is if you don't bow down to this statue, you'll be thrown into a fiery furnace. For a lot of people, it was easy to say, sure, we'll just go along with it. We'll do that. The three young men, Mishael, Hananiah, and Azariah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they refuse, and the king is enraged by this. He brings them in front of him for an official appearance in the palace, and to his face, they refuse. In fact, they go further. They say, look, the God who we serve is powerful enough to save us, and so we refuse to give in. But even if our God doesn't step in and save us, we refuse to bow down to your statue. They just refuse, right? So the king is enraged. Again, the story is not terribly subtle. The king is so upset. Not only is his face all disfigured in his anger, he orders the guards to turn up the heat on that fiery furnace 7 times hotter than usual. And so there, Daniel's 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are all tied up, and they're about to be thrown into this fiery furnace. When they open the door, the flames are so hot that they burst out and they actually catch the guards on fire. Well, there's the 3 young men thrown into the fire. They'd been all tied up, and there they are. And the king and the other guards are watching. I don't know how this works. If there's like a window in the door, I don't understand this detail of the story, but somehow they're watching, and what they see inside the fiery furnace are not just 3 guys, but they're no longer tied up. They're walking around freely, and there's a 4th face with them in the fire, a 4th person there with them who has an appearance like a god, who seems to radiate light or something. And when Nebuchadnezzar realizes that he isn't able to kill these 3, he opens the door and says, "Your God must have saved you." And at the end of the story, Nebuchadnezzar says, "We're not going to mess with your God anymore. Nobody's going to speak evil of your God anymore." What I love about this story is, number 1, the flames that Nebuchadnezzar thought were going to kill these 3 guys turn out only to harm their ropes. The ropes get burned away, but their clothes don't even smell of soot. It's funny that when they come out of the fire, the narrator says they don't even smell like they've been in the fire. Their clothes aren't singed, their hair isn't singed, they don't even look like they've been in the fire at all. But their ropes are burned away. The thing that the empire meant to use to destroy them has only set them free. And all along, there has been this 4th presence with them. The text never comes out and says this was God, but the faithful imagination of saints over the last millennia has said, yeah, this is God's presence with them, right? God's promise is never, I'll keep you from having to face the difficult things. I'll take you out of the bad situation so you'll never have to face it, but rather I'll go with you. I'll be there with you in the fire. I'll be there with you in the trouble. In other words, God becomes the one who makes them able to be brave, right? If part of what helps us to be courageous is knowing there's somebody with us, someone who goes ahead of us to be the example, and somebody who helps us so that we find our own courage, God does that for them. And again, remembering this story happens right along the same time period as the stories of Daniel and the lion's den, and when they're not eating the king's food. Together, they sort of become this community that practices, civil disobedience together, right? They refuse to be violent about it. They're not looking to kill the king or the king's guards. They entrust God will take care of them. They are in God's hands, so they don't need to kill anybody to get their problems solved. But they refuse to do what the king orders. They refuse to worship anyone but the living God, even when it would be so much easier for them to go along with what the king says or to support what the empire wants them to do. In our own lives, maybe there's something we can learn from the stories of the 3 young men in the fire. Number 1, how part of what helps us to be brave is having other people's stories around us, right? A story like this was held on to and was remembered so that later generations would know, yeah, you're not alone. You stand alongside a long continuity of God's people who were willing to say no when the empire says to do something you refuse to do. And that includes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel, and a whole host of others. We're not alone. And also that our way of dealing with those situations, we may be called to be brave and to say, no, we won't do what the empire of the day, whether it's the Babylonians or the Egyptians or whomever else, but we won't kill people. We won't resort to violence to get our way. This is a way of trusting ourselves to God. And civil disobedience may be a lot like the civil rights movement of the 1960s that was willing to take a stand and say, here are things that we oppose, here's what we're going to do. We refuse to comply. We refuse to vacate the restaurant where we're having a sit-in, or we refuse not to march across the Pettus Bridge. But their methods were always about being willing to absorb abuse, being willing to take the pain, but not to inflict it on somebody else. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their story is one of civil disobedience in a way that resonates centuries, millennia, even later. So we're going to wrestle with this story, what it might mean for us in our own lives, and how we also might be called to be faithful rebels as well. So join us for that conversation this coming Thursday around the Bible study table here at Community of Christ. If you can't join us in person on Thursdays for our series, catch us with these video summaries online. See you along the way.